Hey, what's up, AP World? We have Chapter 37 for you. President Eisenhower, the 1950s post-World War II. Let's get going. So let's talk about affluence and anxieties in post-World War II America. So many people are buying homes during this time, and this leads to the growth of suburbs. And we'll talk about a specific suburb in just a moment. And know that part of this, why people are able to buy homes, goes back to the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration, which was a part of FDR's New Deal. This was government subsidized loans to people to encourage them to buy houses. Union membership peaks at 35% in 1954, and it's going to decrease from there forward. Also, we have the cult of domesticity, this idea that's been around forever, essentially, and it states that women were expected to stay home and raise a family. This is exemplified by TV shows in the 1950s. Shows like Leave It to Beaver idealized women in their home life. They would raise two children. They had a suburban house, and they were a stay-at-home mom. In the 1960s, we're going to see a woman, Betty Friedan, come along. She's very important. Make sure you know Betty Friedan. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. This was a best-selling book that launched the modern women's rights movement. This challenged the notion of the cult of domesticity that women should just stay at home. She disagreed with that. All right, consumer culture in the 1950s, we're going to see consumerism increase just like we did during the 1920s. With the birth of McDonald's, Disneyland, and most importantly, credit cards are beginning to be used at a very high rate. Here's Disneyland, not Disney World in Florida, but Disneyland in California. TV, 90% of families by 1960, I believe it was, owned a TV. And their book quotes us as saying it was degrading the public's aesthetic, social, moral, political, and educational standards. Wow, they were saying that back in the 50s, and they're still saying that today. Two people, Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, challenged a lot of roles in the 50s, and they thrust sexuality to the forefront. Elvis Presley would dance often and thrust his hips, and if you saw him on TV, chances are the camera view was from the hips up, so you would not see him dancing. The advent of Eisenhower. Let's take a look at this map really quick. In 1952, you notice that most of this map is red. There is some blue. The blue is the Democratic candidate. And notice that Eisenhower is cracking into this solid South, this idea that the South voted traditionally Democrat after the Civil War. He was a Republican president, and he had a red chasing Nixon as his VP. Remember, Nixon was a part of HUAC, and he broke into the solid South that traditionally voted Democratic, as I just said. And under his presidency, the Korean War ended in July of 1953, and it cost 54,000 American lives and 1 million Korean and Chinese lives. And it was a very, very expensive war. The war ended in a stalemate. It is still divided at the 38th parallel. North is communist, South is not. And he was seen as a grandfather figure. Many people, even those that disagreed with Eisenhower's policy, still liked Eisenhower as a person. All right, McCarthy. Please know that McCarthy was not a part of the House Committee of Un-American Activities, or HUAC. That was Nixon. McCarthy was a senator. He targeted communist sympathizers and those that took over the State Department. So he basically had this list in his hand of people that he said were suspected communists, and they tended to reside in the State Department. It was nothing more than a witch hunt, and often he would go after the opposing party, which is the Democratic Party. He would hold television conferences and publicly say that he had a list of suspected communists. Everything comes crashing down for McCarthy when he accuses the army of having communist officials. He does this on national TV, and he is seen as nothing more than a bully. All right, Jim Crow laws, those that allowed segregation, particularly in the South, were in effect. Emmett Till was a 15-year-old boy in 1955. He's visiting family members in the South. He allegedly says to a white woman at a convenience store, "Bye, baby." She goes home and tells her husband and brother, and a couple days later, Emmett Till is found brutally murdered by her husband and brother. They go on trial, and about 2 hours later, after the trial is over, they are found not guilty. Thurgood Marshall, he is the NAACP lawyer, future justice of the Supreme Court. He argued for desegregation. He was a lawyer in the landmark court case Brown versus the Board of Education. We have the bus boycott, which is kicked off by Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King plays a very large role in this, and he gets his ideas from Mohandas Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau. No Henry David Thoreau in nonviolent civil disobedience. Okay, 1948, Harry Truman issues an executive order that desegregated the military and federal jobs. We have in 1954 Brown versus Board, which ended separate but equal, that was established by the previous court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. So this requires schools to be desegregated, and the court said with all deliberate speed. Now, this is a problem because in 1957, some schools are still not desegregated. This leads to the Little Rock Nine, 9 African-American students that are trying to attend Little Rock High School. Eisenhower takes over some troops and uses the National Guard to enroll them and allow them to go to school. And you can see this poor woman here is being harassed, called names, they're spit on. It's a horrific, horrific experience for them. All right, Martin Luther King forms a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and this involved black churches in the civil rights movement. A sit-in was a very popular way to break Jim Crow laws. First really popular one was in Greensboro, North Carolina, and black and white students would sit at an all-white counter together and they would refuse to leave. And you look and see that there's food poured on them, drinks, you name it. This was illegal because they were sitting at an all-white counter. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it is pronounced, promoted sit-ins and freedom rides, and we'll get to them more in the 1960s in the next chapter. All right, Eisenhower, even though he was a former general, he sought to limit military spending, and he wanted to balance the federal budget. He reversed the Native American policies, the Indian Reorganization Act, which was passed under FDR. He reversed that back to the Dawes Act goals of assimilation. So we see Native Americans being forced to assimilate under Eisenhower. He accepted many of the New Deal programs. He did not challenge them. And one thing he did was pass the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. This is the largest government public works project in the history of the United States. There are 42,000 miles of motorways or roads that are laid. They provided jobs, expansion, and growth of the car industry. Henry Clay would love this. Why would Henry Clay love this? Go way back to chapter 13 and 14. Why would Henry Clay like this? He was in favor of internal improvements. And this helped to hurt certain industries like the railroad industry. This also led to white flight, which is the idea of white people moving from cities to the suburbs. And another reason why Eisenhower wanted this built was in case of a nuclear attack, many Americans could flee the cities quickly. All right, Eisenhower's Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. He had a different idea than containment. Instead of containment, he wanted to roll back the red tide or roll back communism, take a more active approach. This goes against containment, where you leave communism where it is. Rolling back communism means to get rid of it. Eisenhower was in favor of large planes, the Strategic Air Command, using planes to bomb things if necessary, and in theory this would save American lives. In 1956, there's a Hungarian Revolution, so the U.S. has its chance to display its rolling back idea of communism. In Hungary, there's an uprising against the Soviet Union. You can see this is a statue of Stalin that is taken down. The Hungarian citizens revolt against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union absolutely crushes this revolt. They come in with tanks, and they end this as soon as possible. The U.S. does not get involved, and there's a fear of a possible massive retaliation. So this idea that if the U.S. gets involved with the Soviet Union will escalate a war back to the U.S., and before you know it, nukes are going to be used. So the U.S. does not get involved. Vietnam begins during this time. France was in control of Vietnam, and at the time it was called French Indochina. And the U.S. is providing billions of dollars in aid to Vietnam and to the French. In 1954, you need to know 1954, Dien Bien Phu Falls. Then we also have Rock Around the Clock, Einstein, James Dean, Brooklyn's Got a Winning Team, Davy Crockett, Peter Pan, Elvis Presley, Disneyland, Bardo, Budapest, Alabama Cruise Ship, Princess Grace, Payne Place, Trouble in the Suez. As We Didn't Start the Fire. If you don't know it, Google it. It's by Billy Joel. It's fantastic. Lots of good stuff that actually relates to AP. So anyway, 1954, France leaves Vietnam after the fall of Dien Bien Phu. The city that they were in control of, they are no longer in control of. So France leaves. So the question is, who will take their place? Well, the United States is going to enter. With North Korea recently becoming communist and China also recently becoming communist, there is fear that Vietnam could also be communist, and no president wants a country to become communist on their watch. So the U.S. is going to increase its involvement in Vietnam beginning in 1954. If you see an essay on the Vietnam War, You need to write about Dien Bien Phu. This really is the start of the U.S. involvement. And Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel between North and South. In the Middle East, we have a couple issues going on, which we'll get to in just a second. But first, we need to address the Warsaw Pact. This is the Soviet Union's response to NATO. It's simply an alliance for a bunch of communist countries. There is a fear that the Soviet Union will increase its presence in the Middle Eastern countries. So the CIA gets involved in a couple of countries, most notably in Iran. There is a guy by the name of Mossadegh who is elected who nationalizes or takes over a bunch of industries. This sounds like communism to some people, so the CIA overthrows this guy and instills the Shah of Iran. Here is the Shah of Iran. He is a brutal dictator. This will come back to haunt the United States in 1979, as we'll see, during the Iranian Revolution. In Egypt, Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalizes the Suez Canal, which was owned by France and England, and this leads to a little skirmish. That also sounds like communism. The word nationalize freaks people out, freaks governments out, and makes them think that communism is around the corner. The Eisenhower Doctrine, you need to know this. All presidential doctrines, with the exception of Monroe, deals with containing communism. And the Eisenhower Doctrine deals with containing communism in the Middle East. All right, 1956, Eisenhower is reelected. He wins in a landslide, 457 to 73. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, which starts a space race. You need to know that the launch of Sputnik leads to an increase in spending on education and technology in the United States. NASA is established in the Sun Belt, which is an area that goes from California all the way down to Florida and then up to about North Carolina and Virginia. NASA is established in Florida and in Texas. There's a huge increase in spending in education and science. Again, please know that that is a result of Sputnik. In 1960, we have the U-2 spy plane incident. U-2, Sigma, Paola and Kennedy, Chubby Checker, Psycho, Belgians, and the... I know I'm a terrible singer. Just go watch Billy Joel. He's much better. All right, here is a U-2 spy plane by the United States. Flies at a very high altitude. It was shot down over the Soviet Union. The U.S. says, no, that's not our spy plane, bro. We were just doing some weather research. And no, they figured out that the U.S. was, in fact, spying. This leads to increased tensions. 1959. Fidel Castro comes to power. He ousts a brutal dictator by the name of Batista, and he confiscates all foreign-owned land. What does that sound like? He's nationalizing it. Sounds like communism. There's Fidel Castro. Cuba quickly becomes a satellite to the Soviet Union, and in 1961, the U.S. responds by placing an embargo on Cuba. We still have an embargo on Cuba today. The election of 1960, very important. Former Vice President Nixon, he was the vice president under Eisenhower, versus Senator John F. Kennedy. There is fear of Kennedy's Catholicism. He actually becomes the first Catholic president, but many Americans feared that if he became president, the Pope would essentially be the president, or rule the president. Role of TV in the election. This is huge. JFK, if you were to watch TV, most people said JFK won the debates on TV. If you listen to the radio, most people said Nixon won the debates on the radio. The reason why is Nixon came across as very nervous. He looked old, he looked pale, he refused makeup. TV plays a role in the election for the first time in U.S. history. Kennedy wins by an electoral majority of 303 to 219, but the popular vote was extremely close. All right, Eisenhower goes away. He is overwhelmingly admired by Americans. Alaska and Hawaii also joined the Union in his last couple years in office. And the thing that you really need to know about Eisenhower when he leaves is his farewell speech. He gives a warning of a military-industrial complex, this fear that the U.S. could build up its military too big. He warns against that. U.S. does not listen to his message whatsoever. All right, that's it for Chapter 37. Thank you for watching. If you have not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. Help spread the word. If you could take 30 seconds and put this on Twitter or Facebook, I would greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this, and good luck on your AP exam. And thanks for watching. Have a good day, guys.